All right, and now we will go ahead and transition to our next speaker. Thank you, Daniel.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions. I enjoyed them.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. So hi, I'm Logan. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Priti Shah. Dr. Shah is a professor of cognition and cognitive neuroscience and educational psychology, and her research addresses how students think and learn and what we can do to support their learning. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and feel free to ask questions in the chat even while I'm talking. I'm happy to answer them. So this is a really nice follow-up to Daniel's presentation, actually quite connected. So every day you encounter things in the media like, I can't see the slides, the 9 health benefits of asparagus, or asparagus amino acids helps deadly breast cancer to spread, or eating asparagus may prevent a hangover, how Facebook improves memory, Facebook makes us sadder and less satisfied, Facebook turns people into narcissists, single-sex education can plant the seeds of lifetime benefits for girls, or single-sex education unlikely to offer advantage over co-ed schools. So when you think about science, you tend to think about things like chemistry, biology, and physics, whereas the kinds of topics that I just presented are things like health, nutrition, human behavior, educational questions. And you might ask, well, how much do learning how to evaluate evidence and learning about reasoning about science in science and math classrooms, which is where a lot of that education happens, apply to everyday reasoning? And Bao and colleagues actually asked student teachers in the United States and China to answer this question. To what extent would how well you can do in science class predict how well you do on reasoning? And they said, is it 100%, 80%, 50%, 20%, or 0? And what they found is that both teachers in China and in the United States thought that learning science in the science class should be connected to your ability to evaluate science in everyday contexts. But in fact, when they looked at the data, this is what they found. They looked at a study of 5,000 students that were freshmen in science and engineering colleges in the United States and China. And they were tested in mechanics, electricity, and magnetism. And they were also given a test of scientific reasoning. And the test of scientific reasoning asked questions like about controlling variables to control for confounds in experiments, or reasoning about probability, or understanding that correlation doesn't imply causation. So the kinds of everyday reasoning skills that you need to do not real science, but sort of traditional natural science and other sciences, and the extent to which they're connected to ability to do things like mechanics, electricity, and magnetism. And what they found was that, perhaps not surprising to you all, the Chinese undergraduates outperformed the US undergraduates on the measure of the mechanics test. They also outperformed undergraduates in the United States on electricity and magnetism. However, these two groups of students did quite similarly on the measure of scientific reasoning. And furthermore, we have found similar evidence of this in testing. I have to go back to my slide. Where'd it go? In testing undergraduates at the University of Michigan. So at Michigan, we asked students to answer, respond to, and critically evaluate studies like this. As part of a recent study, researchers measured children's body fat and surveyed mothers about the amount of control they exert over their children's eating. The results of this study, conducted with 77 children aged 3 to 5, found that those with the most body fat had the most controlling mothers when it came to the amount of food eaten. This shows that when mothers exert more control over their children's eating, the children display less self-control. So in this study, they're basically making a causal claim that mothers exerting control over their children is causing the children to have less self-control and thus become obese. But as you might have guessed, you can't really make that causal conclusion based on the data or information presented here. But when we asked students explicitly to look for flaws in the conclusion, can you conclude this based on the evidence that you read? Students were unable to do so. So if they didn't believe that this was possible, then they're identified this correlation causation flaw a little bit more than 20% of the time. So 80% of the time they thought it made sense. And if it was consistent with their prior beliefs, like, it makes sense that having a controlling mother would make you less self-controlled, 95% of the time they didn't notice the flaw. So in my laboratory, we study scientific reasoning in everyday contexts, and everyday contexts are different from traditional classroom science classes for numerous reasons. One is that there's motivation. So you accept what you want to believe and you reject what you don't want to believe. So if you love asparagus, you're more likely to believe the evidence that asparagus is healthy. If you hate asparagus, you're really kind of pleased to read that there might be some negative consequences to eating asparagus. Your prior beliefs and expectations also play a role. So you accept evidence that conforms with your prior beliefs, and you reject evidence that doesn't fit. And then there's also a feeling of trust or lack of trust in science. So you might have an attitude like, well, scientists change their minds all the time. They're often wrong. They have agendas. And so that also affects evaluation of science in these everyday contexts. And in general, in school, you don't really have practice applying reasoning rules. Let's say you're controlling, doing a controlled experiment of a car going down an incline in your physics class, and controlling for everything else like the mass of the car and so on. You don't necessarily think about that applying to everyday contexts. And so in my lab, we study if there's a set of consistent domain general errors. Who makes these errors? Are some people more likely to make these errors than others? What conditions people are more likely to make these errors? And how can we teach people to avoid making these errors? I'm just going to give you one quick example study in which we're able to increase people's ability to notice flaws in correlational data. So we gave participants studies that look like this. This is a fake study. Religious involvement deters recreational and medical marijuana use, researchers find. And this describes a correlational study between how often people attend religious services and whether they use marijuana. And what we found, and then we asked them questions like, should I start taking my kids to church more to prevent them from using marijuana? Okay. So can we reduce this causality bias? So if people come in and they think that's plausible, then they tend to just believe this data, even if you can't really draw a causal conclusion from this. And to teach people to avoid this flaw, we first teach them about the flaw itself. What I mean by that is we tell them the abstract rule about correlations can arise for numerous reasons, like it could be A causes B, but it could also be a reverse causal relationship or a third variable, as Daniel points out. So we explain the abstract rule, and we have them draw diagrams showing what different models might be. We also have them work through some concrete examples, and we literally take advantage of belief bias. So if you want to argue against something, you're more likely to notice these flaws, and we take advantage of that. And so we asked participants in this particular study to diagram possible models like marijuana use causes reduced church attendance, or poor health causes both reduced church attendance and increased marijuana use, and so forth. I'm going to go a little tiny bit faster. So we have a study with an intervention group, a control group, they're randomly assigned, and they do a pre-test evaluating everyday science and a post-test. And we measure causality bias. Well, let's just focus on the first one. We asked them, to what extent do the study's findings support the journalist's conclusion that going to church deters marijuana use? And I'm going to point out the last one too. We have people generate alternative explanations. So can you think of other things that might explain this correlation, and ask them to draw those effects? Skip. All right. And so they go through a bunch of different examples. And what we find is that people in our experiment, they get better at judging whether or not you can make a causal claim. We call that claim evidence coordination. So you can see in the intervention group, people are less likely to think you can make a causal claim after the intervention than in the control group. We also find that they're better able to make decisions about, say, what they would do. And they're also more likely to generate alternative explanations. So this is an example of a study in which we identify a reasoning flaw, and then we teach people to avoid it. And we test whether that avoidance occurs at other times and with other contexts. And so we find that this bias can be reduced with a brief intervention, and the intervention improved people's ability to generate alternative explanations, and the diagrams seem to support their abstract thinking about alternative causal models. And now we have developed a correlation causation game for adolescents that we're testing. And so children read articles, and then they play around with causal diagrams to reason more deeply about the data. And we're now testing this with adolescents, and we have an entire science in the news curriculum that we've been developing to help students apply scientific reasoning to everyday contexts. So in conclusion, everyday scientific reasoning is hard, and science education doesn't really help people reason about everyday science. Thinking exercises that include diagramming and generating alternative explanations helps people learn about science better. And people with the willingness to reason about new information and change their mind are better at reasoning and avoiding belief bias. And that is all. So went pretty fast there, but I don't know if we have any time for questions. Do we have time for questions, Natalie? Natasha? Sorry.
Totally fine. We have like 1 minute per question if anyone has any.
Also remember, if you're not comfortable asking your question with your name attached to it, we also have the anonymous Q&A form. Actually, I'll post the link again.
Well, I can also answer questions later during the conversation.
Hey, I have a question. If no one else is asking, my question is, I just wonder how far the training generalizes. So if you train people on this game, do they get better at reasoning, like, about very unrelated sorts of things? Or is it just things that are very similar to what they were trained on, or what do you think?
Most of the examples that we give people are in the realm of behavioral sciences, both in the transfer and training tests, but they're relatively distinct. Like one might be about educational experience, another about parents and obesity and so forth. We haven't tested farther transfer than that, but that is one of the things that we're doing now. Thank you for asking.
Very interesting.
Awesome. So yeah, we will certainly have time for plenty of questions at the end, and we'll have a little facilitation too. But for now, we will move on to our next speaker, which is Madison Fansher. So as she's sharing her screens, Madison is a PhD candidate studying thinking and reasoning. In the past year, she studied how people understand the COVID-19 data visualizations shown in the media and how this understanding relates to real-life behaviors, which is all very relevant right now for all of us. So, Madison, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Maddie. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking to you about scientific reasoning and how how people understand topics related to COVID-19 in their everyday browsing, whether they come across a media article or they're watching a news, how do they understand and interpret the science that's shown to them? So my collaborators and I, the COVID Cognition Research Group, we've been studying topics related to cognitive psychology and COVID for the last year. So many of these faces will look familiar. Dr. Priti Shah, my advisor, Pia and Maddie are all part of this team. Okay, so I'm going to go over a few different topics that we've studied thus far in our group. So the first one is, how well do ordinary Americans, or just everyday people, understand the growth of COVID-19? How do they understand exponential growth and how that relates to disease incidence? I'm also going to go over some research we've done on how well people understand what it means to flatten the curve and whether they understand what daily and cumulative COVID graphs we so often see in the media illustrate. And lastly, I'm going to go over some preliminary evidence that we recently collected, looking at how data visualizations can help people understand the risks associated with getting COVID-19 vaccines. Okay, so our first topic, how well do people understand the growth of COVID-19? And more specifically, do people understand how viruses spread exponentially? So in this first line of research, we gave people news articles that talked about the spread of COVID in the United States. So this was at the very beginning of the pandemic. So this was in late March of 2020. So basically, we kind of describe what the situation is with COVID, and we showed them a graph that illustrates the growth of COVID in the last year. And then we asked, not the last year, excuse me, the last few weeks. We asked them, how many cases do you think that there will be 3, 6, and 9 days after the last data point? So that's that data point here. We asked them basically to extrapolate this curve and estimate how many cases there would be in the future. So we found generally that people aren't great at forecasting exponential growth, which isn't surprising given a large body of research showing that people tend to think of exponential growth as more linear than it actually is. So we found that at the very beginning of the pandemic, people tended to underestimate the spread of COVID by approximately 100,000 cases. And we found that after a few weeks, people slightly improved, but they were now overestimating the spread of COVID-19 by approximately 100,000 cases. Okay, so our next question was, does mode of presentation of the data matter? So within those little news articles, we varied whether people saw the case data in terms of a graph showing an exponential function, or we also randomly assigned people to view the same data but in tabular form. So we had two groups of participants, those who saw graphs and those who saw tables. We found overall that viewing tables helped people make better estimates of the growth of COVID. So here we have our data from the very beginning of the pandemic, and here we have our data from a few weeks later. So the black dashed line represents the true growth of COVID, while the blue line represents the estimates produced by the people who saw tables, and the red line represents the estimates produced by people who saw graphs. So you see consistently across both studies that the blue line is closer to the black dashed line, indicating that the people who saw tables were more accurate in predicting the growth of COVID. Our next question was, is understanding this exponential growth of COVID-19 related to real life behaviors such as social distancing? And what kind of individual predictors, such as how good people are with numbers, political orientation, education, how do those predict whether one understands the growth of COVID and whether or not they follow social distancing guidelines? So this work was spearheaded by Maddie, who was kind enough to introduce me. So basically what she's found in her modeling is that political orientation strongly predicts social distancing behavior. So people who are more conservative are less likely to engage in social distancing. We also found that people who are more liberal greatly overestimate the growth of COVID, while people who are more conservative slightly underestimate the growth of COVID. And then we also found slight evidence for a relationship between understanding of exponential growth and social distancing. So the more you understand the growth of COVID, the more likely you are to engage in these kind of social distancing behaviors. Let's see, chat. Okay, so I see you have a question in the chat. Was it mentioned to people that cases increase exponentially? Yes, so they were supposed to infer that the cases are increasing exponentially. And we have another question. Did we do anything where we gave people the trends on a log scale? So no, we personally didn't, but other researchers have, and they have found that if you show people the data transformed on a log scale, they're much better at reading these kinds of graphs than the traditional exponential growth. And then I have another question. Are the measures of social distancing based on self-report? If so, do we know that they're valid? So they are self-report, so no, we don't know that they're valid. However, like, these were anonymous responses, and we wouldn't expect social distancing to, like, there's no reason why we would expect self-reported social distancing to vary between people who are good and are not good at estimating exponential growth, if that makes sense. So it's not an ideal way to measure social distancing. Other researchers have looked at things like credit card data. So are people making more online purchases or in-person purchases as a measure of social distancing? And other people have used things like looking at cellular GPS data to see how far people are traveling away from their home. But we didn't use any of those kind of more complex measures. Okay. Our next question was, how well do people understand what it means to flatten the curve? So basically, in order to understand the importance of flattening the cumulative case curve, you have to understand what the daily case curve represents and what the cumulative case curve represents. So this is an example of a daily case curve, where on the x-axis we have days, and on the y-axis we have number of cases. So each bar represents a day and the number of cases that were reported on that day. So we tested participants on their knowledge of the relationship between daily and cumulative cases. So this is an example of one of the questions we asked. We showed them this daily case curve, and then we gave them 4 different options of cumulative curves. And we asked them which cumulative curve describes the daily trend that is shown. So if you're not sure, the cumulative case curve represents the total number of cases up until that point. So the cumulative curve is never going to decrease because it's a sum of all the daily cases, right? So the correct answer is this flattening curve, right? Because since we're summing the number of daily cases over time, as the numbers we're adding get smaller and smaller, the slope of this line is going to decrease, right? So if we had 0 cases per day, this total number of cases function would never decrease. It would just have a completely flat slope of 0. Unfortunately, people don't seem to understand this concept, and it's been well documented in the literature that people fail to understand the relationship between daily and cumulative curves in general, not just in the context of COVID. And we found that people tend to choose curves that look most like the daily case curve we show them. So even though this function represents a sum and thus it's impossible for it to decrease, people tend to choose these decreasing functions because they look like the daily case curve we showed them. And this work has been predominantly done by myself and also Pia, who's going to be giving a talk after me. So since people are so poor at determining the relationship between daily and cumulative cases, we decided to try out some different interventions. So we tried out one intervention where we kind of gave them some basic instructions on how to relate the cumulative and daily case curves. And then we ran another intervention study where we gave them a series of short instructional videos, basically explaining what it means to flatten the curve and how to relate the cumulative and daily curves. So I'm going to show you a short clip of one of those videos. So in this clip, I'm basically relating this whole idea of daily and cumulative functions to a real life context, or a context that people may be more familiar with. So I'm talking about a number of people who have attended a movie. So hopefully this will kind of give you an idea of what kind of information we were giving participants. Okay. Let's see. Another example, The Revengers has been in theaters for 1 week. At the beginning of the movie's release, lots of people see the movie each day, but by the end of the week, less people are going to go see the movie. Even though less people watch the movie as the week progresses, this doesn't mean that the total number of people who have seen The Revengers decreases, it just grows at a slower rate. It's the same thing with the number of coronavirus cases. So even if the number of reported cases goes down to 0 per day, the cumulative number of cases will never decrease. Okay, so you kind of get an idea of what we were showing them. And so we compared an intervention group to a control group, and participants were randomly assigned to either group. And so at pretest, so we asked them to relate the daily and cumulative curves for a bunch of different functions. At pretest, we found that the two groups performed equivalently. And then immediately after seeing the intervention, we see that the intervention group had a better understanding of the relationship between the two graphs. And then we see that this effect lasts 2 to 3 weeks after they see the intervention and 6 to 7 weeks after the intervention. So this seems to be a pretty strong effect. And we also see that their understanding of the relationship between daily and cumulative functions transfers to other non-COVID scenarios as well. Seeing this intervention was associated with improved understanding, as well as greater endorsement for social distancing policies. So the more people understood this concept, the more likely they were to endorse social distancing policies. And we have some preliminary evidence that about 2 months after they were given this intervention, people who were in that intervention group are self-reporting greater use of masks in public and compared to the control group. And we have no explanation for this other than our intervention, because participants were randomly assigned to groups, and at no point in either intervention or the control group do we mention anything about mask wearing. So that's a pretty interesting finding. Let's see, what's in the chat? Education works. Yes, it does. Okay. All right, and our last question was, how can we use data visualizations to help people understand the risks associated with COVID-19 vaccines? So this is some very new data that we have, but I thought it would be worthwhile to mention it because it's pretty relevant. So this week, the CDC recommended that vaccine sites halt administering the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Let me read the chat. Yeah, it's from yesterday. And what the media was publishing is that 6 out of approximately 6.8 million people have experienced a rare blood clotting side effect. So when I saw this, I was concerned that this may increase vaccine hesitancy among the public. And vaccine hesitancy is already pretty high when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine, just because it was manufactured so quickly. And there's this general anti-vax rhetoric that's been going around on social media for the past decade. So I was wondering, can we use data visualizations to reduce any hesitancy people may now feel toward getting a COVID vaccine after seeing this announcement? Okay, so I know you're probably wondering what you're looking at. So this video actually has 1 million black dots. So each black dot represents somebody who's been vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Out of this 1 million dots, there is one red dot representing a person who experiences this rare blood clotting side effect. So the purpose of this visualization was to visually show how rare it is that you will experience this side effect if you do get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Oops. Okay, so we randomly assigned people to either view this visualization or not view a visualization at all. And then we asked them questions like, rate your agreement with the statement, this announcement makes me more hesitant to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So we do see, it's important to note that vaccine hesitancy seems to have increased because of this announcement. So people are saying that they're around, I don't know, 70% more hesitant now than they were yesterday after this announcement came out. And we see that showing them this visualization called an icon array significantly decreases hesitancy by about 20%. So this is a huge decrease. We also say something about their concern for their safety. So are you concerned about the safety of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine after this announcement? Overall, people are more concerned about their safety. However, showing them the icon array alleviated some of their concerns. And then we also asked them, compared to yesterday, are they less likely to recommend that their friends and family get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? And we again see that showing them this icon array seems to decrease their hesitancy to recommend that their family members get this vaccine. And so the three graphs that I've just shown you are in the context of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But something else I would like to mention is we found that this announcement increased hesitancy towards getting any COVID vaccine, not just the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, although the hesitancy isn't quite as severe. And we again find the same pattern. When we show them an icon array, they are less likely to be hesitant or concerned about the safety of all COVID vaccines. Okay, so in conclusion, understanding the influence of data visualization on scientific reasoning has important implications for real life behaviors. And understanding topics related to COVID-19, such as exponential growth and flattening the curve, is related to social distancing behaviors. So this work may inform best practices for teaching the public about topics related to the spread of disease, so that they may make more informed decisions. And yeah, so thank you. And this work was kindly sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And I also just wanted to mention our website, covidcognition.org, that talks more about our interventions and some of our group's research in detail. So thank you. Anonymous question, what is the advantage of showing? Sorry, I'm trying to understand this question.
I think it might be that they're wondering, they're saying cumulative graphs might be difficult to understand if people don't have prior training in reading them. So why show the cumulative graph versus like a new cases graph?
Yeah, so showing the cumulative graph is just a way of showing the number of cases thus far. And so that's a separate piece of information from the number of new cases. And so seeing that in the media kind of shows how quickly the virus has grown or stopped growing over time. So it can kind of help us track the growth, if that makes sense, over the last year. Yeah, and as Pia mentioned, this graph is extensively used in the media, which is why we were studying it. Also relevant to the flatten the curve question, have we flattened? So there are multiple interpretations of flattening the curve. So in our research, we were talking about flattening the cumulative curve, which would correspond to a daily case curve with 0 new cases a day. So absolutely not in that context, we have not flattened the curve.
I have a question.
Yes.
Earlier, I thought you said, but I could be wrong. So if I am, just tell me. I thought you said that this intervention where you taught people to kind of realize that the curve was flattening, which meant that you would asymptote as opposed to have a line going downward. I thought you were saying that that this predicted more social distancing behavior in the future, but you weren't sure why. Is that right?
No, so it understanding promoted endorsement of social distancing. So basically when we showed them these graphs, we said like these graphs illustrate the data for a hypothetical country. Like how important is social distancing for this country? And so if people understood the relationship, they rated importance of social distancing as higher, if that makes sense.
I see. But were you saying that's the thing you weren't sure why they did rate it higher?
I don't remember when I said that. I'm sorry.
Okay. I thought it was somewhere around there, and then I was thinking, well, I guess if they understand that the cases aren't going down or just asymptoting, that would lead them to think that social distancing is more important.
Yeah, so we showed them curves that had varying trends, right? And so one of the main issues was that people thought that a flat daily curve corresponded to like everything's okay, right? And so when you taught them that a flat daily curve is actually bad and leads to a linearly increasing cumulative function, then they were more likely to endorse social distancing policies for those hypothetical countries with flat daily curves. Does that make sense? Okay.
I see. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Madison. That was great. So if there aren't any more questions right now, which again, we can come back to shortly, we will move on to our last speaker. That would be Pia Lalwani. And Pia is also a graduate student in investigating age-related changes in the brain. Today, she's going to be discussing her work using machine learning for brain reading and how that informs our understanding of individual differences in healthy aging. So Pia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maddie. So I'm going to be talking about something quite different from what you've been hearing, but it will still hopefully inform how we think about science and like how it affects us in everyday life, because all of us at some point, unfortunately, will age. And I'm going to also talk about machine learning applications, which almost make you feel like future is here. So I'll just give like a really quick introduction to magnetic resonance imaging, which is MRI that we use for understanding what is going on in the brain. I'll also give a quick introduction to what is machine learning, and then talk about its application in the aging research, which is what I do. So you guys might have seen an MRI before. It's this giant scanner that looks like a hole where you lie down and go inside. And it's a giant, strong magnet. It has the word magnet right in its name. But when I say strong, it's incredibly strong. It's like 100,000 times the Earth's magnetic field. This is the magnetic field that helps align your compass to point north and south. And not surprisingly, if you were to take anything metallic in a room with this MRI machine, it would fly literally across the room and get stuck in there because of how strong it is. And true story, my first time at the scanner, I forgot my wallet in my pocket, and all my credit cards, which have this magnetic strip, were completely wiped because I took it with me in the scanner. So this is what we use. And we use this to study the brain because our blood, which contains hemoglobin, has iron. And the oxygenated hemoglobin versus the deoxygenated hemoglobin have different magnetic properties. And we can measure these different magnetic properties to understand what part of the brain is in use. So the part of the brain that is in use needs energy and oxygen. And that's where your blood rushes. And that causes changes in magnetic properties. So you basically measure those to see which part of the brain is in use. So ideally, if you were seeing something, then it would be your visual cortex that's active. And that's the part of the brain that I'm going to see activity in. If you were listening to music, it would be your auditory cortex, which is here on the side of your brain. It's the temporal cortex. If you were tapping your fingers or dancing, it would be your motor cortex that would be active. So depending on which part of your brain is active, I could tell if you were watching something, listening to music, or a combination of the two. However, it's not just that. I could also tell which finger you were tapping. So were you tapping your left finger or your right finger? Humans are what we call contralateral in their representation. So if you're tapping your left finger, it's the right part of your brain that's active. And if you're tapping your right finger, it's the left part of your brain that's going to be active. I could tell based on your activity again, what you were doing. However, instead of looking at all these images myself and figuring out what was going on, I use something called machine learning. And using machine learning, we can even find more nuanced differences. So can I tell whether you were watching, you were seeing someone's face like Mona Lisa, or were you seeing some place like Eiffel Tower? And I have a really small, brief introduction to what machine learning is.
Our ability to learn and get better at tasks through experience is part of being human. When we're born, we know almost nothing and can do almost nothing for ourselves. But soon, we're learning and becoming more capable every day. But did you know that computers can do the same? Machine learning brings together statistics and computer science to enable computers to learn how to do a given task without being programmed to do so. Just as your brain uses experience to improve at a task, so can computers. Say you need a computer that can tell the difference between a picture of a dog and a picture of a cat. You could begin by feeding it images and telling it, this one's a dog, that one's a cat. A computer program to learn will seek statistical patterns within the data that will enable it to recognize a cat or a dog in the future. It might figure out on its own that cats have shorter noses and that dogs come in a larger variety of sizes, and then represent that information numerically, organizing it in space. But crucially, it's the computer, not the programmer, that identifies those patterns and establishes the algorithm by which future data will be sorted. One example of a simple yet highly effective algorithm is to find the optimal line separating cats from dogs. When the computer sees a new picture, it checks which side of the line it falls on and then says either cat or dog. But of course, there can be mistakes. The more data the computer receives, the more finely tuned its algorithm becomes, and the more accurate it can be in its predictions.
Okay, so that was like a really quick introduction to what machine learning is. And what I'm training my machine learning on is not looking at faces and places, but rather the images of the brain while you're looking at faces and places. But like they mentioned, there are limits to how much you can tell things apart, how well your machine learning can do. For example, if you were seeing twins, then your brain activity would look rather similar, and it would be really hard for the machine learning algorithm to tell it apart. The other limitation would be if the MRI scanner was not strong enough, my images would be really blurry, and it would again be really hard to tell things apart. And finally, it also depends on, are you an expert? So imagine your neighbor has a new litter of Labrador puppies, and they can tell them apart, but you can't. If you spend enough time with these puppies, you're going to develop the expertise and actually tell those puppies apart. So if you're an expert, your brain is going to be able to represent that information separate enough for my machine learning algorithm to be able to tell what you're seeing. And we are all human experts. So we have been human face experts since we were born. That's something we've been learning to do. And that's why we actually have an area in the brain that represents this information quite distinctly. So it's called fusiform face area. If you were to take the brain and like flip it over, it's like right at the back, like at the back of your brain, but flipped over inside. And a damage to this area can cause something called the face blindness, where people can't recognize faces, but everything else is rather intact. We also have an adjacent area called the parahippocampal place area. And as you can see, these regions are quite close by, but they're still separated out from each other. So if I was to use a machine learning algorithm, I would be able to tell if you were seeing a face or a place. And that's what we see. So here is how my machine learning performs, right? This is on a scale of 0 to 1. 1 is where you are getting it absolutely correct every single time. 0 is when you were never getting it correct. And 0.5 is the chance where if the machine learning was just guessing, so it has only 2 options, it can choose face or place, and if it was just randomly guessing, it would be correct half the number of times. So that's the chance line. But here is what happens with aging. So you see that with aging, this accuracy goes down. So my machine learning is unable to predict with as much accuracy whether you were seeing a face or a place. And furthermore, the older adults whose brain activity looks more similar to young adults, where the machine learning is able to do quite well, are the ones who have higher behavior performance. Whereas the older adults with lower machine learning accuracy are the ones who have lower performance. So this could be behaviors like speed of processing, memory, etc. And this suggests that we obviously all want to be like this. We want to be high functioning older adults. So an interesting question is, what causes these individual differences? And that's basically what my current research focuses on, is why is it harder to do brain reading in older adults? How can we change it? Is it true of all parts of the brain? So I told you that faces and places are hard to distinguish in older adults, but is that true of, say, the auditory cortex, where they're listening to music versus whether they're listening to speech? Is that hard to tell? What are the long-term consequences of it? Is it just momentary individual differences, or are these older adults the ones who are more likely to develop disorders like Alzheimer's or dementia? Those are the kinds of things that our research focuses on. And in terms of one hypothesis that we currently have about why older adults have this lower distinctiveness is GABA. So GABA is basically an inhibitor in your brain. And this evidence essentially comes from monkeys, where visual cortex of monkeys have selectivity for different orientations. So if you were to see a vertical bar, the particular neuron in a young monkey really likes this vertical bar, has a really high firing rate. But a horizontal bar is not so appealing, it has a lower firing rate. So you can see that this neuron is particularly selective for vertical bars. But in older monkeys, you do not see this. You don't see any preference for a particular orientation. However, when you inject GABA in these monkeys, the older monkeys' neuron starts looking quite a bit more like young monkeys. So it now has a preference for vertical bars and not for the horizontal bars. So you can see there's a depression here. So there is lack of activity here. This suggests that application of GABA can improve visual function in monkeys, but we're still quite far from being able to do that in humans. But in future, we hope that development of pharmaceuticals will help similarly restore function in aging humans. And another future use of brain reading is something you might have all recently seen in news, which is Elon Musk's Neuralink. It was all over the social media. It is where a monkey is able to play video games with its mind. And instead of what I do, which is put my subjects in an MRI machine, what they did was put electrodes inside the brain of the monkey. And they used machine learning again to look at the activity in the monkey's brain to decide where the monkey wants to move his joystick. So without actually moving the joystick, the monkey was able to communicate with its mind, with the machine, to play the video games. And this tech has great applications in future for quadriplegics who can navigate the world with the help of machines and mind. And that's where like the future is going. And that is all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Pia. That's super cool. Really cool stuff. If anyone has any specific questions to Pia, we can do that shortly here. We have, let's see, let's send the link in the chat again, I think. Oops.
So Pia, can I go and eat those chocolates that have GABA in them? Is that just going to improve my brain functioning?
You would think so, right? But we don't know. Like I said, with the monkeys, it's really easy. You take a syringe, put the GABA exactly where you want it. But with any kind of drugs where you're going to just take it through tablets, it's going to go affect your whole brain. And we actually know that it makes you sleepy. So I'm not sure if it will work. It's also GABA is like a common ingredient in your anti-anxiety pill. So I'm sure it would do weird things.
Daniel
Cool,
asks if GABA and chocolates cross the blood-brain barrier.
That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe Logan knows. He knows more of that information.
I unfortunately do not know the answer to that question. I know it's a very popular health food additive in Japan, or at least it was a number of years ago. But I don't know if it actually crosses the blood-brain barrier. I do have a question about the Neuralink thing because I have not seen too many details about that. So the monkey is controlling the game using its mind, but it's holding on to something in the picture. Is that just like a juice tube, or like what, like?
Yeah, that's the juice tube. So it originally has, so I just had the picture of what it does later. First, it has a joystick. So it does use the joystick to move and play video games. And that's the information that you train your machine learning on. And then you take away the joystick. And first you just remove the connection and you see that it's actually just the mind that's doing it. And then you take away the joystick as well and it still works. So he's just holding on to the juice thing. So he gets a juice every time he wins points.
Cool, thanks.
We have a general anonymous comment that I think is referring to the COVID cognition website.
That sounds right.
So it looks like someone went and tried it, and after the pretest module, find the curve module, there's an error page. So just whoever I can
do that. Thank you.
Awesome. So I think we have a few questions then for well, if the audience has any questions, of course, please throw them in the chat or unmute or use our little question form. Plenty of venues. But to start with some panel questions, just a few to our speakers that were so gracious to talk to us today. What do you guys see as research's role in public policy being, and what obstacles might there be in overcoming the barriers to integrate the two?
I mean, unless somebody else wants to go first, I have a couple of thoughts. I thought some of the work here on interventions that Madison and maybe Priti presented were very relevant to public policy, as was Pia's work on aging and looking at how brains change as they get older. I think so I think there's relevance, but I think one barrier to translation sometimes is that scientists are often their goal is to publish papers in kind of these obscure academic journals, many of which live behind subscription paywalls that the general public, including government officials, can't read without a subscription. And I think if at least, I think basic science is really important and should be done. But I also think that if some of the goals of scientists were to actually have an impact on public policy, and therefore maybe some of these studies, like maybe I'm just pulling it out of my hat, but the interventions that I think Madison mentioned, if some of those were performed in the general public, or if somehow, there's lots of messaging on television, like don't smoke cigarettes or call 1-800-QUIT-NOW. If some of these interventions were done as maybe public messages of some kind, then maybe their impact would be greater as opposed to just being published in a journal or something like that. And I think this isn't specific to the research that Madison and Priti presented, but in general, I think academics are publishing for a very scientific audience as opposed to for like changing the world. So that seems like one obstacle.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a potential option for addressing that are kind of the more open source frameworks that have been becoming more popular for people to put their work out there, whether that requires a peer review or not. Then it is more accessible then for the general public, which aids in overcoming that issue.
Well, although I also think that there are many preprint servers now where there's like thousands of articles, and most of those are just like written for scientists. Whereas this forum that you guys have organized is really much more for the layperson. So I think scientists, if they want to affect public policy, might make a greater effort to, translate their research for the public, to really talk about it in layperson terms, to, like you all have done, invite community leaders to try to attend things like this, and even maybe try to have projects like research projects where you team up with some kind of government agency and say, how can we work together to solve this real world problem? I mean, I think that sometimes I just feel like if I was a busy government official, the first thing I would do would probably not be to seek out a preprint server and go through thousands of papers until I find Madison and Priti's work. It would be easier for me if, somehow it was brought to me in a very layperson way.
I think that very nicely leads into one of the other follow-up questions that we have is, this is actually also for the audience, is that how can we as scientists bring our research to the community? What are the avenues where the community wants to see science, and what's the type of science that you want to see? So like, how can we cater to you guys essentially? Or even for the panelists, right? We are all members of the Ann Arbor community. So what type of science would you want to learn about that's not in psychology?
I always liked Saturday morning physics, which is something that the physics department does for public outreach. And the psychology department also has a library series. Different faculty members speak once a month, but it would be amazing to me if I could hear from things like meteorologists, climate change people, medical professionals. I think that in Ann Arbor, there's a lot of hunger for hearing about science.
I agree, and something else that interests me is this plume. There's this like contamination in the water supply that's like spreading at a tiny, very small rate, but it's caused by some company, maybe forget what the name of the company is, but they were polluting the water supply many years ago, and it's still there. So yeah, it'd be interesting just to like hear about local issues, right? Also that could be relevant.
Yeah, I think oftentimes we find ourselves so stuck in our little psych bubble, especially, that it ends up, we don't get to learn about a lot of these cool other avenues since we spend all of our cognitive resources within our own field. And then there's fewer avenues that we know how to burst that bubble, let's say, a little bit.
I recently attended, I was presenting in one of the high school students meet a scientist events, things like that, which the Natural History Museum organizes. Those are, I think, really cool. I felt like I learned a lot from all the other speakers because I didn't know what they were working on. So those kinds of events that are just like open to public, which have like short talks, are really nice because they don't have we can be from the science community and still feel this, where we don't really get what people are saying because it's too specific to their field.
I wonder how this will change in between communities, because Ann Arbor is nice. It's like a nice small town where everything is so centered about the University of Michigan. So I think also the community there is much more prone to go and listen to science, right? But if we are changing to, I don't know, Florida, Tampa, where I am right now, that would be a completely different story. And so one of the interesting things to debate is how different science approaches would work or excuse me, how different science communications approach would work for different communities.
I think that's a huge problem, Madison.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so this is kind of related to your question, but I think that one important part of getting people to think more about science is having scientific literacy courses in education. And so that's actually something that Dr. Shah and I have been working on. So we're developing a curriculum to teach middle schoolers and high schoolers about basic scientific reasoning principles. So I think getting them introduced to the concept of science and what is good and bad science might kind of intrigue them and make them more inclined to pay attention to science in the future.
Great, thank you. I think what I was going to say is that also a part of what we as scientists have to do is that we can't just be like, oh, here's our science and like take it, right? We also have to understand the needs of our community that we're in. And it's on us to be able to like start that conversation with our community to bridge that gap and say, okay, what are the things that the community needs? What do they want to know about? What do they want to listen to? So for example, in this talk, we heard that people want to learn about like the environment, meteorology. And so those are the types of things that like we can maybe make events that cater or that present different types of science that essentially is catered for our community instead of just being like, oh, well, you know, this is like a big name. This is like someone who's really famous in cognitive psychology. And so we want them to talk at our talk, right? That's not the goal. The goal is that like this is for our community. So we need to have that dialogue between the community, what the community needs, and also the scientists.
I think that's an interesting point, though, still about how different communities don't always have their like a centered university. And so getting maybe like what Daniel said, like widespread coverage on like even in a marketing sense, almost like of your research findings in a obviously like a legitimate way to convey the findings would be a really thoughtful, I think, avenue that researchers can kind of try going down.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do with our COVID cognition research website. And so the key there is being able to advertise the website. But I know that you can do things like pay for Facebook advertisements if we want to reach a widespread audience. But on that website, we're presenting our research in a way that's easy for everyday people to digest. We explain why the research is relevant to them, how we're not trying to make them think anything, but we're trying to give them information so that they can make informed decisions for themselves and for their family. And so we're really trying to give the public our science in a way that's easy to understand, is appealing to them, has real life implications for them, and is formatted in a way that can be easily distributed to anybody who has internet access.
Cool. I think we might wrap up here shortly, but what about one last question to our speakers about what would be one thing that you would hope listeners take away or can do in their own lives from your talk?
Evaluate scientific research and don't just believe the hype. I guess that's what I would say is try to just, think about, is it really true, and evaluate the study rather than accepting it at face value.
Anyone else? I know that's kind of the zinger question.
Be curious.
Brain is really cool.
Brain is really cool.
And I feel like you get the sense of future is here, right? Like you can now start thinking about how your mind is going to be controlling things. It's a fun thing to think about. Also really important in terms of how we might need to start considering ethics of all of this. Something that we will have to address.
I would say that psychology research is important for things other than just psychology. So for my research, it's not really about psychology. It's about how do people understand the spread of disease, which has huge, like, what's the word I'm looking for? impacts beyond just like understanding how the brain works?
I think actually something that's coming out in this is that for people to maybe think about what technique is the most useful. So here we're seeing that Pia talked about aging and studying the brain and GABA, and you really need some sort of technique that allows neural measurements to ask about the aging brain. But on the other hand, I think what Madison is talking about is using just behavioral methods, like teaching people how to interpret graphs and things like this to help them behave better during pandemics, maybe do some social distancing or masks. And I think that, that's important for people to realize too, that science can make progress in different ways depending, or use different techniques to make progress depending on what the question is. So it's important to choose the best method to answer or address the problem.
Related to that then, choosing the best question, we have a question in the chat, Daniel, that is a great question, but how would you go about improving critical thinking skills then to think better about these questions or how to conduct research?
Is that a question for me or for the scientific reasoning people?
It is a question for any of you, but you led into it nicely.
So as an individual, what can people do to improve their own critical thinking?
So one thing that you can do is to remind yourself of belief bias and motivated reasoning as you encounter information, both information, if it's already something that you're prone to believe or be motivated to believe, then remind yourself that that's the time when you really need to focus on being critical. And when it's something that you might be motivated to not believe, that's also a time to be open-minded and sort of consider the possibility that maybe what you're reading has a solid basis. So that's one thing that you can kind of do that's really an attitudinal or dispositional shift. And then another thing that you can do is seek out multiple high quality sources of information. So consider a lot of disciplines have spaces in which scientists communicate to the public and do it in lay terms, but are clearly respectable scientists who've done a lot of research and have peer-reviewed publications and so on. So a lot of the reviews in, say, magazines like The Atlantic, they've often been very well vetted and really great science. There are some really fantastic science writers in the media, so looking out for those is also very helpful. So, and then finally, sort of starting to teach yourself what these flaws are in science evidence, like the stuff that Daniel and I talked about to some extent. So things like, is there a confound? There are just a handful of standard things to look out for. What's the effect size? Is it a big difference or a small difference? What's the sample size? What's the population of the study? So you can ask all of these questions. And in fact, I think that maybe Madison has a beautiful chart that gives you all of the questions in nice format that she might be able to share.
If you share that with us, then we'll actually send it out in like a summary email after the event to everyone who RSVP'd, and we can share that.
I just wanted to add one other, there's a list and I think a summary chart would be helpful. But I think one other thing that has helped me a lot is just to adopt a very skeptical kind of attitude in general. Like, I had a cousin when I was a kid and she and I would argue about everything. And it was just like, I would say one thing, she'd see it. I'd be like, I'm doing this to be nice to you. She'd be like, no, you're sneaking around to get to play with that toy before I can. She figured me out and I figured her out. But the idea is that if you can think of alternative explanations for everything that you read, and the more you can think of them, or the more reasons you can argue against something, that really helps to kind of evaluate the study. Because if at the end of the day, you answer all these questions that I'm sure Madison or the group will send out later, and it's like, oh, the study sample, was it appropriate? Oh yeah, it was appropriate. Or were the statistical analyses, were they done right? Oh yeah, they were done right. But if you can be skeptical in all these ways and then get the answers to these questions, I think that's a lot a lot of it, just seeking alternative explanations and always kind of,
I would like to balance sort of being skeptical and seeking alternative explanations with at least understanding that there are experts, right? So we can't necessarily, at least I don't feel like I have the prior knowledge and skills to say evaluate research in climate change, and things that I might think are potential flaws, maybe they have been considered by the experts. And so it's all, while being critical, it's also important to consider what your level of knowledge is in a particular discipline. And so I think that it doesn't hurt to attend to expertise to some extent.
okay, I agree with that, but I'm going to give some hope. I'm going to give some hope just to illustrate the idea of being skeptical. I'm going to give some hope to those who are not experts in climate change, like I am not. And I remember there were these old predictions. They were like, oh yeah, the whole world's going to warm up. These icebergs in Antarctica or something are going to melt by the year 2200 or 2100. And there are these models that say it's going to be that, you know? And I remember when I heard those predictions and I was like, I wonder if those models have accounted for all the variables. Like, I'm not an expert, but like, you know, there could be a lot of reasons why icebergs would melt. And if they haven't accounted for all the variables, the icebergs may melt faster. Maybe they'll be melted earlier than 2200 or whatever the estimate was. And then a few years later, some updated estimates came out that was like, oh yeah, they're gonna melt before 2200. And what happened is that they said they discovered, surprisingly, maybe not, that water wasn't just melting the icebergs from the outside, but rather that the icebergs had developed cracks and that the water had seeped into these cracks and was getting inside the iceberg and melting it from the inside as well as from the outside. And when I heard that, I was like, oh yeah, I guess they didn't account for that variable 5 years ago when they first, and they were saying that essentially on NPR. So I think even as a person outside of this field of climate change, I could already have this intuition just by being skeptical that, well, maybe they haven't fully explained this or accounted for it.
Yes, I think that a reasonable, smart person could come up with alternative explanations or potential factors, but it's important to then not just reject the science, but to question it further, to ask questions, to read more, because it's very easy to just say, oh, well, psychologists are all flawed or whatever. And because there are a lot of really smart people that are thinking very deeply in domains that they have a lot of knowledge about.
Oh yeah, I'm not suggesting that all science is wrong. I'm just saying that I think to be a good consumer of science, though, we always need to be asking these questions, and hopefully we'll find in many cases that, oh, we can't find flaws with this science. I think that's great, and there is great science out there. And yes, we have to trust some experts sometimes, but I think we also have to remember that even experts make mistakes. And so, like these people with the glaciers melting in 2200 or whatever it was, so I think it's a balance.
Yes, for sure. I think, I don't know how to say your name, Gosia, but you have a really good comment that evaluating science is really time consuming. And if you want, you have to be able to reason well, but also know where to find good information and also know some key things to think about every time, right? So that you have some rules of thumb that can be applicable, that you can learn quickly.
Indeed. And I mean, this is a really, really good discussion. One of the things I'm just very, very concerned is if you are trying, I think each one of us wants to be a really good scientist, and each one of us wants to be an expert in almost everything. I just personally think it's very, very difficult to become an expert in everything and develop critical thinking for so many different things, because one of the things that I just faced basically was, okay, I started to learn biology this year and turned out that it's very, very difficult to catch up with my fellow students who were maybe having training in molecular biology, or they were having training in immunology, and I'm just sitting there being a mathematician. And how do you learn quickly to criticize things, or not criticize, excuse me, to evaluate things that are outside of your expertise?
Right. Yeah, I think it's got to be a balance.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really hard to learn quickly, how to criticize things outside your expertise. But, I guess I'm speaking more generally, like if scientists want to engage the public, maybe we should, as scientists, try to talk to the public in a way they can understand without all the jargon. And even tell them, like, here are some useful questions, like Madison just dropped into the window. And if the public is given these questions, they can ask scientists during their presentations or things like that. I also think that if scientists ever work with public officials, on solving real world problems, that these would be the sorts of ways in which scientists could help those officials. They could say, these are the sorts of questions that are important for evaluating studies, and here are some of our answers. We're experts, we understand it better, but here are some of the answers to these, what we think are important questions, and that might be helpful to them for exactly the reason that you state, because they're not trained scientists. But we can help them to evaluate the studies, I think, by pointing out these questions, by providing some initial answers.
Maddie posted in the chat the book by Barbara. And so that's one way on our end as scientists that we can help others, like scientists in other fields, understand our work so they don't have to become experts in psychology or in cancer biology in order to understand what we're doing. And so being able to like write clearly and concisely and without like super complicated terms of like, what am I studying in the brain and like all of these brain regions and this like all of these neurotransmitters, for example, being able to communicate that to a more general audience is also really helpful. So we can work on this from our end in our own fields as well.
I very much agree with you, Natasha. This is because this is very, very, very important, because I'm sorry, but nobody will understand when you're coming out and like saying, oh yeah, I have this protein that has like 3 binding sites and it's going to bind something else that will then send signals and promote proliferation under this and that conditions. Like nobody understands that. And it's very, very important for us to learn how to talk about science without using scientific terms.
Absolutely. I think, let's see, do we have any last questions from the audience? I think that was a great kind of final discussion, unless we any others.
Just want to point out that Logan put the free download of Barbara's writing workshop in the chat. She posted it online for free for everyone.
To aid accessibility.
I have a last comment, which is thank you to everyone who organized this event. I think it's really great to have this kind of exchange and to involve people from outside of our department. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. This was a lot of fun.
And thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. Your presentations were very informative, and I think they greatly furthered the conversation as well.
And to our attendees. So I think that wraps it up then, but we really appreciate everyone coming and participating. These were some really good discussions.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you everyone.
Thank you.